This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. All right, so in this rewatch, we have finally reached the Joe Flacco period of the Browns football season, which means we're kind of heading towards the final stretch of this rewatch. And now that we are in the Joe Flacco experience, we get to talk about the Joe Flacco experience and do a bit of a postmortem as we go through these games. Now, the one thing I will preference this review rewatch by saying is I believe that this game that we got by Joe Flacco against the Rams is pretty much everything that is the Joe Flacco experience in 2023 in one game. You got literally everything, good and bad, in this game. Joe Flacco makes some incredible plays, some incredible last-minute throws, some deep balls in this game, some good throws, like some legitimately impressive stuff here by Joe Flacco. He also turns the ball over a couple of times, kind of becomes his worst enemy at the end of this game, which is also a valid part of the Joe Flacco experience. And the offense is very feast or famine, right? And that is a huge part of this game. So let's talk about the reaction to Joe Flacco, which was one of the more interesting things at the tail end of the season. As interesting as Joe Flacco's play was, I don't think his play informs why people reacted to him as much as the context that surrounds Joe Flacco. And the context that surrounded Joe Flacco was that he was replacing DTR or the possibility of playing PJ Walker again. And no matter how you flip it, DTR, PJ Walker, they were clearly the worst quarterbacks that played for the Browns this year. And they were very limited. PJ because of decision making and DTR because of physical limitations. He just could not get the ball where he needed to get the ball consistently. And the offense was the most limited probably with DTR in there because of those physical limitations and him being a rookie. You throw in Joe Flacco and you not only have this huge jump in arm talent, right? The arm talent of Joe Flacco is laughably like better than what DTR has to offer. You have this expansion of what you're able to do offensively in the pass game because Joe Flacco is the opposite of a rookie. Like if you just took the years that Joe Flacco turned 18 to like right now, there's like a kid that could be playing like college football as a junior between DTR. There's that much of a gap between those two players as far as what you're going to be able to do. So you go from somebody who can't throw all the passes, who does not have the greatest arm talent in the world, who's also a rookie, to a 17-year vet in Joe Flacco, a guy who's been to a Super Bowl, and somebody who can throw the ball still pretty far. Like he got that Uncle Rico arm strength. And that jump was like going from standard definition to HD. It was massive. It was a massive leap in what you were able to get away with at the quarterback position in retrospect. So that, I think, informs a lot of the reaction. Like you think of Joe Flacco as being this huge upgrade to the Cleveland Browns, not because he was better than like Deshaun Watson is who he usually gets compared to, but because he replaced DTR or going back to PJ Walker, and Joe Flacco was head and shoulders a better option than going back to one of those two quarterbacks, which makes you feel like that was a huge leap. Now, again, to be respectful to those two quarterbacks, DTR did win a game versus Pittsburgh. PJ Walker won 2 games, almost won 3 games if he doesn't throw an interception in that last drive against the Seattle Seahawks. So those two were able to get wins on the table still, but Joe Flacco was more capable at that position. From an arm talent perspective and from a processing perspective, he was more capable than both of those quarterbacks. That all kind of combined for this storm that was FLACCO Mania. And it is a interesting storm to talk about because, again, some of it is justified. If you just strictly look at what Joe Flacco did as a street free agent, as a 39-year-old street free agent, this is some of the most impressive stuff that you have seen in that circumstance ever. That doesn't mean it's some of the most impressive quarterback play you've ever seen, but it does mean in the context that Joe Flacco existed in, it was pretty impressive. He gave you highlights almost every week, and he was willing to just put the ball anywhere. Sometimes that meant he was going to throw a bunch of interceptions. Sometimes that meant he was going to make the big plays. And we kind of expected that there was a chance that Joe Flacco could come in here and throw a ton of interceptions because that's kind of what he did in his last couple of stops. But we did not expect that he would even it out with the amount of big plays that he had. The interceptions, about what we expected. The big plays, he matching the interceptions with the big plays is not what we expected from Joe Flacco. So it was a nice upgrade for where the Browns were coming from DTR at quarterback. And that upgrade, along with some excellent defensive performances, did help the Browns get to the playoffs that year. And certainly something you can't take away from Joe Flacco. I don't think if you just put anybody else in there in retrospect, that the Browns are going to be able to go 11-6. Maybe they go 10-7 and win and get to the playoffs, but I don't know if they are like the 5 seed lock and get the rest their starters in week 18. That does happen because Joe Flacco did play well in certain stretches during his run. In this game, one thing I noticed was Elijah Moore. I thought he was really good in this game. I thought he showed signs of him being who he could be. And I think this was one of the games where the Browns used him properly and the offensive line was able to hold up enough for Joe Flacco to be able to take some of these shots down the field where Elijah Moore is going to be his most effective. I know a lot of people throw Elijah Moore automatically because of his body type as a slot receiver, but he really is a outside threat. And in this game, he did a great job getting some chunk plays and just getting open. I thought this was one of the most impressive games Elijah Moore had all season, and this shows you who he could be if he continues to be put in the right situations. And hopefully with Jerry Jeudy taking the load off when it comes to the slot responsibilities for the Cleveland Browns, I think that puts Elijah Moore in a situation where he's going to have maybe less targets overall, but better targets, right, for each one. And he'll be a lot more efficient next year and effective when it comes to winning games. Defensively, and I think this is something that gets super forgotten, right? Because a lot of the focus on the injuries that happened to the Cleveland Browns, we put that focus on the offensive side of the ball. But we really do forget how injured this defense was by the end of the season, and especially the secondary. This was at a point of the season where Denzel Ward was out. They still had Martin Emerson, who I think was working through something. You also had Greg Newsome, who was also working through something, but you had to play a lot of Khalif Halisi and a lot of Mike Ford. And those two got picked on by Matt Stafford a ton in this game. If you're wondering if the problems that pop up, especially at the second half of the season, if these problems are something that we should be concerned about going into 2024, I don't think so. Or at least anything I saw in this game is something I should worry about going into 2024, because I think a lot of the Browns' points that they gave up like 36 points in this game. I think a lot of those 36 points, you can point to the reason for it happening being we had Khalif Halisi in and Khalif got cooked on a post route, or we had Mike Ford in and Mike Ford got cooked, or Joe Flacco throws an interception, or there's a safety, right? Like a lot of these points aren't really about the Browns' structure defensively being compromised because of something that Sean McVay's doing. It's just Sean McVay attacking where the Browns roster is weak because of injury, which is less repeatable, right? Like that's not something you worry about going into 2024. So I walk out of this, it wasn't a great game by the defense by any measure, but you look at why it wasn't a great game by this defense and you go, okay, we know what went down in that game. And I think we really forget just how injured that secondary was. I see a lot of people like talking about the Browns defense being bad because they gave up a lot of points on the road or at the end of the season, but they neglect that, your starting safety was out for a good chunk. Grant Delpit was out. Like you were down almost all three of your safeties for a good chunk of the end of the season. The Browns defense got hit with that injury bug super hard after week 10. And you're going to see that pop up more and more during the rewatch. And that's why we do the rewatch, so we can remember things like that. So we're not just looking at the Brown season and thinking and pulling these splits from these box stats and not noticing the fact that, hey, there were less starters in these games. It's probably a reason why these numbers look like that. Instead of drawing conclusions from just the raw numbers, you need the context around it. But yeah, the Browns defense, I thought they were fine in this game for the most part. They gave up a couple big plays. They had some injuries. It definitely showed that they had a ton of injuries going on. Myles Garrett was working through a shoulder in this one as well, so he wasn't as effective as he usually is. And you could tell he couldn't really lift his arm much in this game. So a lot of this did come down to Joe Flacco. And look, Joe Flacco in this game was pretty damn good for most of it, right? There were some cold stretches where he went punt, but it didn't matter because the Browns defense was holding up pretty well when the offense went cold. And then there was a point where Joe Flacco brought this game within one. The score is 19-20, and it's like, 8 minutes left in the fourth, and you're feeling pretty good. Unfortunately, the A side to the Joe Flacco experience is great plays are being made. Look how great he looks. He's making these good throws. Oh my God, he doesn't look like a 39-year-old. And then the flip side to that is Joe going Joe sometimes, and Joe went full Joe in this one. Completely imploded in the last 6 minutes of this game. Like his last 3 drives were just god awful. He throws a interception, I think on the first or second play of this next drive, which turns into a touchdown on the other end from the LA Rams because they get it in Browns territory. So not fun there. And then on the next drive, he really just does not do a good job seeing the field. They end up going 3 and out. Well, not 3 and out, 4 and out. They turn the ball over on downs. And then the next drive after that, Joe Flacco takes a sack, another sack, and then a safety. So like just the worst 3 drives you can imagine for somebody. And look, that's just kind of what the Joe Flacco experience was. It was very up and down. I saw somebody on Twitter use the term like Linsanity to describe this Joe Flacco run. And I think that's a good term to describe it, because Linsanity was like, wow, look at these incredible shots that this random dude is making. And Joe Flacco is not a random dude. But the throws he were able to make during this stretch of games, you just don't expect him to be able to do that very often. And that's kind of what happened there. This is just kind of what the Browns were in retrospect. Now that we're removed from the excitement and the optimism of wanting the Browns to be as good as possible during 2023, we can really look back, do a postmortem, and see what they were. And this is just what they were. They were the same team in this game against the Rams that they were in every other game that they played with Joe Flacco. The only difference is they were playing a playoff team in the Rams, right? When you're playing the Bears, when you're playing the Jets, when you're playing the Jaguars in the middle of a 4-game losing streak, when you're playing the Texans without their starting quarterback and their starting wide receivers, it's easier to beat up on those guys. And it's easier to hide the fact that your defense is very beat up at this point. At one point, you had no safeties, none of your starting safeties left, right? It's easy to hide the fact that you're playing a 39-year-old quarterback who was signed off the street in October. It's easy to hide Khalif Halisi and Ronnie Hickman and DeAnthony Bell when you're in those situations playing teams that aren't the worst in the world, but you're definitely better than. But when you play those teams on your level, all of a sudden, Joe Flacco being 39 and being Joe Flacco, it starts to matter. Those interceptions start to become less forgivable. It starts to be something that becomes a backbreaker, right? Instead of something you can come back from, because the other team is starting Justin Fields. The injuries in the secondary are where this shows up the most, right? When you're playing Justin Fields, it does not matter that your secondary is injured. When you're playing Zach Wilson, it does not matter that your starting secondary is super injured. When Case Keenum in 2024 is passing the ball against you, again, it does not matter that Ronnie Hickman is out there. But when it's CJ Stroud or Matt Stafford, yes, it does matter that Khalifa Lisi is out there trying to guard Puka Nacua. It does matter that Ronnie Hickman is out here trying to stay on top of Nico Collins, right? Those things start to matter more. And I think this was just, in one way, because this game was the first game, we kind of ignored the result. But in retrospect, this game told us everything we needed to know about the Browns for the rest of the season. They were going to be a competitive team. They were going to be better than most teams. But when it came down to playing real playoff quality teams that are playing playoff quality football, these flaws that the Browns had because of injury just weren't going to be able to be overcome as easy as it looked when we were playing teams that weren't playoff quality. And that's kind of what it was. That's my thoughts on that game. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. You have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.